Hello everybody, today we're going to talk about reverse kick and reverse bass. Now I recently got a message from one of my patrons talking about a so-called suction effect. And that is actually a fairly accurate description of what a reverse kick and sometimes also a reverse bass tries to do. But as you can imagine, I was really a little bit flabbergasted by that because I really didn't think of reverse kicks as that way. I just saw them as like the small transition thing that you do to get back into your main kick. But then I realized that I never really made a video on this topic, so that is what I want to do today. Now, as you can see, we are in the project that we used for the last video as well. And as you can see, it has grown quite a bit from just the kick and bass that we had before. But if you zoom in over here, you may see the section that you remember, where we were talking about synchronizing bass lines with parts of the kick that weren't even there. And you may have heard in that example that there was this kind of sweeping sound up here, which is one of the two ideas that I'm using in this particular track that is kind of like a reverse kick in the sense of what it does to the actual sound. If I play this with the kick and bass, you can hear what kind of impact that it actually has. So you can hear that we get a little bit of a suction effect out of this sound, but there's also other parts where we're using the other type, which is going to be the reverse kick. So just scrolling through the track, here's a good example of where you can see a kick that is reversing, and it's just happening at the end of this kick fill. And you'll notice that without it, it doesn't really sound like it flows neatly into the next kick drum that is about to appear. It just kind of starts again here, but with the kick reversing into it, it really sounds like, actually like the user was saying, you're getting sucked back into the beat. So we'll get to that bass line a little bit later because there's some synthesis involved in there, but first I want to talk about the kick. And the reverse kick is really nothing more than a kick that is actually reversing. As you can imagine, a kick drum is a sine wave that is sweeping downwards over time. And just by the shape that I drew earlier, just going down like that, you can imagine that it has a little bit of impact. You can imagine you hit this kind of wall, and then that wall is kind of enforced with the stuff that's happening below it. So that is really impacting you, and you get a lot of punch from that in your body. Now just imagine a car crash, which is obviously also an impact. There's a very big involvement of an impact, otherwise it wouldn't be a crash. But you can imagine taking a car crash and just reversing the footage. What you'll see is kind of the car being sucked out of the wall. And the exact same thing is actually also happening in our kick drum over here. We have this effect that's speeding up over time, so you can see that we have the sine wave, which is just going faster and faster. So you can imagine that you're kind of being sucked back into the beat. It is literally this idea, but then in reverse. Now there is one interesting thing to note here, and that is when we look towards the end, you can see that the transient is missing. What I've essentially done is I have taken the very first part of the kick and I've laid it a little bit later, so that when we chop that off, we don't go all the way back up to the top of the frequency where the kick drum starts. And what this essentially means is that the click that is happening over here is still going to have its own unique impact. You can imagine that if we make it like this and we remove any of the fades, you get a very aggressive sounding reverse kick idea. This one even gets almost like a glassy transient to it. And even if you do something like this, you get a fairly snappy reverse kick. What I like is just getting the sub part. So here you can see the lowest frequencies, and it kind of goes into the lower mid-range of the kick drum. And we just want that effect being sucked back in, and then still we want to get all of the click and all of the punch from the original kick drum only. Now the idea behind this bass is kind of similar in that it achieves the same thing, in that it sucks you into the next beat. So if you just listen to this part over here again. You can of course hear that the synths are also helping here in the way that their sound design on top, but in the lowest frequencies you can kind of hear that we get the suction effect back into the beat. And in this case, it isn't coming from the pitch, it is more coming from the filtering. One of the first things to note is that I have this bass line on its own unique track. So there's the longer bass, then we have our little suction ideas over here. There is a progressive version of this bass that I'm using elsewhere in the track. Then there's a channel that is completely empty, and then I have my main rolling bass line. But the suction effect is on this track over here, and if we turn off the EQ that I have on it, what you can hear is that it's just kind of like a sliding bass. So it still has a little bit of pluckiness in there. This would go really well with the kick. If you play this, you get a fairly progressive idea out of it. And that was originally the idea behind the sound, to have a little bit more of a progressive stab there. But what I noticed is that what you can do is you can just add an EQ and kind of shape the frequency later to the way that you want. And in this case, I thought that the suction effect was just better sounding. So now we get a much deeper sound, as well as it's going up over time, so it's kind of opening up towards the end here, which in this case is the actual suction effect that you hear. And by the way, the bass itself is just a version of this bass line over here, with all of the envelopes. So these two envelopes over here set to a quarter note. So just set over 1/4, as opposed to 1/16. And the same is true here. I believe I even modified the volume to be a little bit later still. And then I rendered that out, and there's a bunch of fades on it. In this case, there's a little bit of fade already on there. So I consolidated it before, and then I added another fade. But as you can probably imagine, just take your main bass line, render out a quarter note version of that, chop off the very beginning, and then kind of fade it in so that you don't get the initial start of the transient. You don't want that click that your bass line starts with. You just want to have the sustain kind of after it, and then from there on, you can make it slide in with EQing however you want. Now that's actually going to be the part on the reverse kicks. Now I want to talk a little bit about what you can do to kind of find these things out yourself. Just because the video is so short, and I think I can put this on at the end and give you guys another useful tip. And that tip is to look at your music. You mean like this? No, I don't mean like that. No, what I mean is actually looking at the waveform. Wait, wrong shirt. Like this waveform over here, for example. If we zoom into it, you can see the individual kick drums, for example. So over here, over here, over here. And keep in mind, this is a busy mix. So you can still see the kick drum, you can still see individual bass notes. If we really zoom in, you get to see the details as well. We can see the transient of the bass note over here. We can see kind of how the tonality of the bass note is going to progress in just the main shape that we have in the waveform here. And what you'll find is that even within the mix, it is probably going to line up pretty nicely with the waveform that you're going to get inside of Psyscope. So just comparing this shape to this one over here, you can see that it matches up pretty neatly. So just in general, you can use the waveform to kind of make judgments on what the kick and bass is going to sound like and what it's going to feel like. And of course, this means that you need to look at a lot of waveforms in order to get an understanding of what it's properly going to do. But now if we zoom into the part where we had our reverse kick from before, what you'll see is that it becomes pretty clear what this actually is. You can see the reverse kick happening over here. We can see this kick drum, this is pitching down, right? So you can imagine the sine wave going down. You should be able to deduce then that therefore this is a sine wave going up. And we already have an element in our track that is doing that, so we can just extract that from the element that is doing that, and then in this case reverse it, and then just put it in our track. Where I really want to get to with this bit is really trying to tell you that when it comes to music production, there's many more tools than just your ears that you can use in order to train your ears to be able to hear in the way that they need to hear in order for you to make music. Because there's this neat sentiment that a lot of producers have, and that is that you should only trust your ears and never really trust your analyzers. But the problem is really the other way around. When you're starting out as a musician and when your ears aren't tuned, you don't know what music is supposed to sound like. But you can learn a lot about what music is supposed to sound like by looking at what it's looking like. And this doesn't mean that you should overly rely on analyzers. This doesn't mean that you should analyze everything that you're doing in your production anytime you make a kick and bass, that you check every waveform, that you check every spectrum, that you check all of the stereo information, whatever analyzer that you end up using. Because of course, this whole spiel that I'm talking about isn't exclusive to just the waveform that we've been looking at today. You can use a spectrum analyzer, you can use a waterfall display, you can use a stereoscope, you can use the waveform, or whatever analyzing method that they come up with in the future. You can use all of that information in order to make better judgments on what your music is supposed to sound like. And honestly, not to say something negative about this Patreon that messaged me, but I think that if you look at a waveform and you see something like this, where you see a kick drum over here, and then you see this effect over here, where you feel the suction effect to be, you would assume that somebody would just automatically conclude like, okay, this has to be a reverse kick, right? Because we have this waveform over here that looks very similar to what is happening over here, just in reverse. So let me try taking this part of the kick and reversing it into this part over here. This is kind of the cycle of exploration that you need to do in order to just learn about anything, right? When you're learning a skill, you need to gather some information so that you can make some assumptions and then prove yourself right or wrong by experimenting. You could maybe, for example, say, oh, I see this waveform over here. I'm going to try to sound design that from scratch. And that may not work. That may not get you the result that you exactly want. So then you look into using a kick drum there, and then you get closer. but maybe you use, like we saw before, the whole kick drum and you reverse that, and that is not exactly the sound that you want, and then you realize maybe I need to cut off the start of the kick and then it will work better. At the end of the day, learning music production is just stacking on stacking on stacking of that kind of process, where you're just trying to find something out and trying to analyze a certain sound that you hear, something that you want to make. Maybe it's a mixing technique that you want to try to find or something like that. And once you've made that observation that there's something that you want to create, you have to find out as much about it as possible. So that's going to be everything for today. I feel like that for the last bit, I've been rambling a little bit. I just want to tie this back to actually learning music production, because one of the things that I've been doing a lot more in tutorials is actually talking about kind of the core aspects of just learning things like this. First of all, I think it's really important for people to understand what the learning process is like for music production, and honestly for any creative skill for that matter. And secondly, I feel like this isn't really talked about too much. A lot of people tend to talk about like the small tricks and whatnot, which can be useful from time to time, knowing a few tricks, but really it's all about getting a process where you actually get to learn and actually see yourself making improvements. And as I said, one of the ways that you're doing that is just by analyzing the music of your peers, the music that you're listening to and that you want to sound like, and trying to find out as much information about it so that you can actually learn what you need to do in order to produce that kind of music. Now, there's going to be more videos like this where I just talk about the learning period. I have another one that I'm currently scripting out where I want to talk a little bit more about the experimentation and when it's right to experiment. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Another way that you can support the channel is by doing it financially, which you can do over on my Patreon page, which should be up on the screen right now. So if you do choose to do that, thank you very much. But if you're just here to watch, thank you as well, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.